Hello everybody and welcome to YouTube Lecture 21. Now you may be wondering, well, why is he playing the Harlem Shake? What does that have to do with anything? Well, in just a few moments I'll actually show you. Let's go ahead and get into our lecture here. We're going to be looking at Key Concept 7.2, Roman numeral 1, letter A. So the 1920s is an explosion of all types of interesting things. New technologies is what's going to lead the way to a transformation of society in the 1920s. Our standard of living is going to skyrocket. We're going to have dishwashers and washing machines and vacuum cleaners and brand new cars and all kinds of interesting things. More and more Americans are going to have telephones. The radio is going to become the form of entertainment in our homes. Just imagine on any night of the week, Americans all gather around their radio and just staring at their radio, staring at it, wondering, dear God, when is this going to become a television set? No, probably not. But, television is actually also invented at this time period, but it's such a new technology, it is yet to really, it'll take another couple of decades before it really catches on. But radio is the thing of the day. And it will. Millions of Americans will tune in constantly to various radio programs. Some of the presidents will start to use the radio as well. Calvin Coolidge will give the first annual message delivered over radio. Hoover later on will use radio as well. Radio is a huge, huge part of our lives. And even today, the radio is very important, but mostly, I guess, driving around in our cars more than anything else. These technologies, like I said, not only lead to a greater standard of living, as we see there in letter A, but also is going to bring about personal mobility and certain other things. Well, let's look at motion pictures. Motion pictures, okay, very, very important. Movies, a huge part of our lives. Right? At the beginning of the 1920s, millions of Americans are going to the movies constantly, but the majority of them are silent movies. But in 1927, America is amazed when the very first talkie, they call it a talking motion picture, The Jazz Singer, Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer. And then in 1928, this little guy here. You know him, you love him, you can't live without him, Mortimer Mouse. What? Huh? Well, that's originally what Disney wanted to call him. We all know him, though, as Mickey Mouse. This is the cartoon movie Steamboat Willie. The first talking cartoon is Steamboat Willie with Mickey Mouse in it. Yes, a great pop culture is going to emerge in the 1920s. Baseball becomes hugely popular, becomes America's pastime. Babe Ruth and the Yankees. Football is starting to come around. Red Grange and the Galloping Ghost. You got Charles Lindbergh is flying across the Atlantic Ocean. You've got movie stars. You got radio stars, singing stars. Americans just begin to love pop culture. And consumer culture as well. Americans become a huge consumer society. The big cities, New York, Chicago, these things are just going to draw people into the cities. All kinds of wonderful things going on. The 1920s indeed is a roaring decade. One other interesting thing that happens, here we are still staying in 7.2, Roman numeral 1, but letter C. There's a huge cultural explosion that happens in Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance takes place at this time period. Hence, that's why I played the Harlem Shake for you guys. This is an African-American artistic, cultural phenomenon, but it will express itself throughout the country and will influence all Americans eventually. In music, you get jazz music becomes the music basically of America in the 1920s. Americans can't get enough jazz, and jazz is like the grandfather to every great music that happens in the 20s and the 21st century. Or the 20th century, 21st century. You've got from jazz, you get rhythm and rhythm and blues gives us rock and roll, and from rock and roll you get your disco, your hip hop, your rap, all of that originally can trace its roots back to the jazz explosion of the Harlem Renaissance. Great artists, great writers. I'm going to read to you a little bit from your textbook because, I mean, let's face it, you're not going to read it yourself. So on page 698, the heading here is Intellectual Modernism, and the subheading Harlem in Vogue. It says, as the Great Migration tripled New York's black population, remember the Great Migration happens during World War I. African Americans left the South and went north into California looking for jobs. Harlem stood as the symbol of liberty and the promised land to African Americans everywhere. Very true. A lot of people wind up in Harlem. Talented black artists and writers flocked to the district where they broke with genteel traditions and asserted ties to Africa. Poet Langston Hughes, and there he is, Langston Hughes, a very influential writer of the day, drew on African American music in the Weary Blues, 1926, a groundbreaking collection of poems. He captured the upbeat spirit of the Harlem Renaissance when he asserted, I am Negro, or I am black and beautiful. So the Black is Beautiful movement happens. But this was also not only just a cultural movement, this is Marcus Garvey. It was also an extremely political movement. Our book on page 701 tells us this is a charismatic leader, Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey, and one of the founders of something known as the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey urged followers to move back to Africa. This is also part of the Back to Africa movement. He argued that peoples of African descent would never be treated justly in a white-run country. So a lot of political force happening within the African American community, and especially cultural, art and music and poetry and writing, books, a lot of things. And these things will come to influence white society as well. The Harlem Renaissance is a hugely popular movement. Here is art of that time period. New forms of art are emerging at this time. The 1920s is a very, very fascinating time in American history, culturally speaking. Let's look at some other notable things that happened. Well, January 30th, 1920, Prohibition! Do I hear people cheering out there? Probably not. All right, Prohibition. Now, Prohibition comes to us from the 18th Amendment, the 18th Amendment, passed in 1919. Now again, I'll just read this to you, this section 1 of the 18th Amendment. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, so it was ratified in 1819, so it comes into play in 1920, it says, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into or the exportation thereof from, that's a lot of words, the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Now, I know that was a lot of wordage because, lawyers write this, but there is something there I did not say, and see if you can pick up on it. I'll say just some quick words here for you. Here's what it says. Manufacture, sale, transportation, importation, exportation of intoxicating liquors for beverages purposes is prohibited. So what's prohibited? Again, manufacturing, selling, transporting, importing, exporting. What is not against the law? How about drinking? Doesn't say you can't drink it. Interesting. But because you weren't allowed to sell it or transport it, that's why you couldn't have it to drink. But, Americans love their alcohol. We are a country basically dedicated to getting, a happy time. Speakeasies. These are the hidden saloons that develop. This is a picture of a typical speakeasy. Usually they're in somebody's basement. They could be in a back room of a shoe store. Sometimes they're even in churches. It's funny. The Catholic Church was one of the few places that was still allowed to have alcohol because of communion. They had all of the contracts with the local wineries, so wine was still being produced because of communion. So sometimes speakeasies might be in a church. They could be in an alleyway somewhere. If you guys remind me in class, I'll tell you the story of my grandfather. My dad's dad actually ran a speakeasy outside of Chicago. And he stopped running the speakeasy because of this guy. This guy put my granddaddy out of business. And if you remind me, I'll tell you the whole story in class. For those of you who don't have me as a teacher, that'd be an interesting story, I suppose. Bootleggers and rum runners, these were all these nicknames of individuals who are illegally bringing alcohol into the country. Rum runners mostly were coming up from the Florida Keys. And one guy who got very rich illegally bringing alcohol up through the Florida Keys was a guy named Joseph Kennedy. You might remember that last name. Joseph Kennedy is the father of John F. Kennedy. Bootleggers, also very popular. A lot of illegal alcohol is also going to come in from Canada. Al Capone is a very, very famous. He's not a gangster. He's actually a mafia. He's a leader of a family, a crime family in Chicago. Throughout the 1920s, Chicago became a war zone between the various families fighting for control of the illegal prohibition, also illegal cigarettes, some prostitution as well. Al Capone will famously go to jail not for killing anybody or illegally doing anything except for tax evasion. He went to jail for not paying his taxes. Changing role for women as well. The 19th Amendment comes at the same time, right around the same time. Voting rights for women. This, with the growth of an urban area and a lot of women coming into the big cities, and now they have the right to vote. They're starting to feel extremely enfranchised. They want to throw off all of what their mothers were before them, that old Victorian age image of women, and they became, a lot of young girls of the time period became flappers, and that's a picture of what a flapper looked like. These were young women who cut their hair very short, known as a bob, because women are supposed to have long hair where they're going to cut their hair short. They wore these baby doll dresses. They did not have any problem exposing their legs or their bare arms and things like that. All that was considered, not right for women, but they're now liberated women. They smoked in public. They flaunted all the social norms that women were never allowed to do prior to the 1920s. So women became very much part of the social scene as well, young girls. See, our girls today wouldn't understand any of that, right? All right. Margaret Sanger, very, very important. She's a famous doctor of the time period, and she's very instrumental in the development of birth control. She will come under problems with the Comstock Law. The Comstock Law, which talks about mailing obscenity. She writes a book, What Every Little Girl Should Know. It's about when you're a young girl and you begin to grow up, what happens to you when you go through puberty. And she winds up in violation of the Comstock Act because of this. And eventually will have to flee the country. She'll come back and she'll form one of the first birth control associations in America. And she'll work very, very hard at trying to create birth control for young girls. And eventually, a lot of what she does eventually will bear fruit in the 1960s with the invention of something called the pill. All right, well, that's just my introduction to the 1920s. Hope it whet your appetite a little bit for what we're going to talk about in class for the next couple of days. So some of what I read here to you, starting at 698, but all this goes through page 708. And this is the famous Charlie Chaplin, a very famous movie star at the time period, who's not American, by the way. He's from Great Britain. But he was an extremely famous American movie star because he came over here to be famous. All right, well, that's it, I guess. All right, have fun. Oh, by the way, this won't be due Monday. We'll make this one due Wednesday. All right, see you later.